Interim Executive Director at Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere, Rose. And I have the esteemed honor to introduce today's webinar presenter, Montrece McNeill Ransom, who serves as a Director of National Coordinating Center for Public Health Training. She is also an ICF certified executive leadership coach and a DEI certified belonging strategist on a mission to unleash the power of human potential through belonging. I won't read her full bio to ensure that we all have the opportunity to listen to the content she has to share. But what I will do is lift up. I had the opportunity to listen through this talk before. And when I say Montrece does a beautiful job at being able to provide some introspective thought around belonging and how it fits into the work we do as maternal health practitioners. And so without further ado, I introduce Montrece McNeill Ransom. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Andrea. Thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be in this space with you. I hope you can hear me okay in this Zoom room. I've been invited to talk with you about belonging, the phenomenon of belonging. And when I have these conversations, I like to start by telling my belonging story. And I remember being woken up on a Friday morning. We were living in a tiny trailer park in a tiny town right outside of Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I was confused because it was a school day. But rather than rush me through breakfast and rush me out the door, my mother sat me down between her legs and she began to do my hair. Now, it's important to note, and some of you, so typically it was a Friday, typically it'd be a school day. But rather than feed me breakfast and rush me out the door, she sat me down and she began to do my hair. Now, what's important to note, and some of you all may be able to relate, is typically she would do my hair on a Sunday evening. And that hairstyle was meant to last all week long. She'd wrap it up every single night. It was meant to last all week long. So the fact that she was doing my hair on a Friday was really weird. And typically she'd be super chatty, Montrece, how's your week? What are you learning? What's 2 times 58? But on this day, this Friday, she was noticeably quiet. Her hands, this perfect shade of chestnut brown, trembled as she parted my hair down the middle. And then she brought me my Sunday dress, like the Sundiest of all Sunday dresses, all lacy and pink. And again, this was a Friday, so I was super confused. But that was the day we married Louis Mac McNeill. And when I tell this story, I always say we got married. And I talk about it as our wedding because they always made me feel like we were a team of 3, like we belonged to each other. Our ceremony, our wedding ceremony was beautiful, just the 3 of us in front of a tiny brown church. We stood at the front and we took our vows for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, the vows. And I remember walking out of that church hand in hand. The noon daylight shone in on my mother as she sat in the front of her 1976 silver Pinto pony as we drove home. I sat in the back seat, buckling and unbuckling my black patent leather Mary Jane shoes, really thinking about what just happened. And I leaned my little perfectly pigtailed head between the 2 seats, and I looked to my left at Mac, this 6-foot-tall man, head literally almost reaching the roof of the car. And I say to him, oh, I get it. I see what happened. I can call you Dad now. That was the beginning of my belonging story. Within a year, Mac legally adopted me. About a year after that, I got my first school yearbook. And you all may remember that feeling. I don't know I guess they still give paper yearbooks out nowadays. I don't know, but you may remember that feeling of getting that yearbook and scrolling fast through the pages, trying to find your picture and your name. Well, that's what I did. And I found my picture and my name. And below the picture, it said first name Montrece, last name Williams. And I remember taking out a Sharpie marker and crossing it out. McNeill was the name of the family that I belonged to. I wrote in McNeill. And that was my first lesson on belonging. The reality is, a sense of belonging is something you must create for yourself and for others. It happens by intention, by action. And today, I have the privilege and the honor of serving as the director of the National Coordinating Center for Public Health Training within the National Network of Public Health Institutes, as Andrea mentioned. I'm also a professor. I teach public health law at the University of Miami School of Medicine and School of Public Health. I'm an ICF certified leadership coach and a DEI certified belonging strategist. And people are always like, Montrece, what the heck is a belonging strategist? And simply put, when I work with my one-on-one clients, my individual clients, my goal is to remind them who they are and to remind them that anywhere they are called or aspire to be, they belong. To remind them that they may get it wrong. Sometimes you need to look through the lens of substance over form, but anywhere you are called or aspire to be, you belong. And when I work with leaders and organizations, I teach them belonging-based leadership principles that build team cohesion, that allow folks on our team, our individuals in our workforce to feel seen and valued and heard, and to really allow us to unleash human potential, particularly in public health. Before leaning into belonging, I led public health law-related training and workforce development efforts at CDC. I did that work for almost 20 years. And what I learned was we can do all the training, all the capacity building, all the competency development that we want to do. But if public health practitioners, if healthcare providers, if public health advocates and our partners across the health spectrum, if they don't feel a sense of belonging in their work, if the communities that we're serving don't feel a sense of belonging in our work, if they don't feel seen, heard, appreciated, truly supported, and connected, then none of that training matters. Belonging is what unleashes human potential. And one definition of belonging is to be in the right and suitable place and to know it. And I want you to know that you belong here. You belong in this field. You belong in this Zoom room. You belong here. I know that all of you who have joined us today are passionate about improving the health of women and children and families and the communities that you serve. No matter where you work in maternal and child health and public health, no matter the jurisdiction or the agency or the type of work you do, never before in recent history have your efforts and your passion been more needed, more relevant, more important. I won't cite the statistics and sing to the choir. I know you know it, but we need you. We need your best thinking. We need your innovation. We need your action. We need your full potential unleashed if we're going to reach our health equity goals. So yes, you belong here. But belonging is a two-way street. It requires action and intention. So my ask of you right now is to set an intention, to take action on at least one thing that you'll learn today, just one thing. Be open and be willing to expand your mindset on something you hear today and take intentional, inspired action. This is one way that you can anchor your sense of belonging in the field and in our space today. And we know belonging matters. You know, I've worked in public health for 20 some odd years. You know, I got to give you a little bit of science. We know belonging matters. We know it matters to the workforce. There was a study in 2020 done by Better Up that says belonging leads to a 75% reduction in sick leave, a 55% reduction in turnover, and a 50% increase in performance and production. Imagine that in the public health workforce. We know belonging builds individual and community and neighborhood resilience. It leads to increased social engagement, self and community advocacy. We know that a healthy and strong social and support system, the core of belonging, leads to stronger civic muscle. We know that when people feel a sense of belonging, they're more likely to take preparedness actions in the face of a public health emergency. They're more apt to listen to public health guidance when they feel like they belong. We know that vaccine hesitancy and a lack of a sense of belonging are strongly connected. And we know, based on the science, that there's a relationship between a strong sense of belonging and higher self-rated health across life stages. And belonging also matters in your work as breastfeeding advocates. I want you to visualize a young woman. Let's call her Maya for our purposes today. Imagine that she lives in a rural community near you. Maya is about 20 or 21 years old. Maybe you can visualize someone in your head who fits this description. Maya's got dreams as big and as vast as the sky. She spends her days this delicate balance between tending to her modest garden and working part-time at her local grocery store. Beneath her warm smile and the rhythmic sweep of her broom, this quiet struggle brews. Maya's pregnant, this tiny universe unfolding within her. She's a first-time mother full of fear, uncertainty, confusion. She's heard stories from her grandmother, tales of motherhood, of resilience, of survival. But breastfeeding was always a mystery. In her family, the art of nursing remained unspoken. Yet Maya wondered about the magic of a mother's milk, about the whispered secrets of the nourishment that flowed from heart to mouth. But practicality tugged at her like stubborn roots in her garden. Her part-time job barely covered the essentials, and this idea of extended maternity leave, that was just a luxury she couldn't afford. The thought of pumping in the cramped break room or bathroom during her breaks at work felt like surrendering to a system that doesn't really see her. But fear also really gnawed at her. Fear of the healthcare system, the sterile corridors, judgmental glances, whispers of exploitation. Now, it's important to note that Maya's a smart girl, but she's been skeptical about healthcare and public health and the government since her childhood. Growing up, she heard stories about the U.S. Public Health Service syphilis experiment. She knows y'all call it the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, but she knows better, and she'd rather place the blame where it lies. She's heard stories of medical exploitation on enslaved people and the harvesting of Henrietta Lacks cells for research without her knowledge or consent. Maya's heard stories of women dismissed, their pain trivialized, their voices drowned in the clinical hum. And the statistics haunted her, haunted by the maternal mortality rates that disproportionately affect women like her. And to be clear, Maya's not ill-informed, right? She's not prone to conspiracy theories. Maya says she just doesn't have the luxury or the privilege of assuming that the government or the public health or the healthcare system really has her or her baby's interest at heart. But one day, Maya stumbles across a magazine article in that break room during her lunch break at the grocery store. And the glossy pages of the magazine spoke to her about the importance of breast milk, the antibodies, the bonding, the irreplaceable nourishment. She traces her fingers over the images of mothers cradling her babies, their eyes filled with love and purpose. And for the first time, she really considers the possibility of breastfeeding. But practicality, reality, was much harsher than those glossy pages, right? No one in her family had breastfed. Her grandmother, this pillar of strength, had raised her children on formula. That had been what had been passed down in her family. The women in her community whispered about cracked nipples and sleepless nights and the weight of expectation. And her part-time job, totally unforgiving. When she gets up the nerve to ask the manager at her grocery store about using the breaks and the break room for pumping, he raises a skeptical eyebrow. And he says, Maya, you know we're short-staffed. I don't know about all that pumping stuff. You're gonna have to figure this out. His tone really final. But Maya longs for that connection, that bonding and the health benefits that she's read about, the sacred act of feeding her child from her own body. But the system has set up boundaries, barriers for that sense of belonging. For when it comes to the system in which we work, she doesn't feel like she belongs. The reality is that history weighs heavily here. And if we want to address health equity and breastfeeding and across all public health issues, we got to be real about the gravitational pull that history exerts. In so many ways, this is inherited trauma, and it still impacts us to this day. And it's obstructive to feelings of belonging, of psychological safety in this country and in the work that we do. And I want to ask you all to use the chat, use the thumbs up feature if you can, and let me know how many of you all remember learning about Maslow's hierarchy of needs in school or along your professional life. I know I learned about Maslow's in the 8th grade for the first time. I remember it very clearly. And I remember thinking, how is it even possible to reach the level of self-actualization? This theory comes from this guy named Abraham Maslow. He was a 1940s American human psychologist. And he said that our needs as humans fall into 5 tiers. And he arranged those tiers in a pyramid you see on your screen here. And he said that only after successfully satisfying the need at one tier can you then move on to the next. So at the bottom of Maslow's hierarchy is the need for physiological well-being. So the basic need to eat and hydrate and sleep. But once satisfied, we can then move on to fulfilling our need for safety and shelter. And then once we have food in our belly and a safe roof over our head, we can then move on to what he calls the higher order need of belonging. And according to Maslow, the need to belong, this need for belonging is so basic to our humanity that we have to satisfy that need to fully develop our self-esteem and our confidence. And that development of self-esteem and confidence must happen before we can reach our full potential, or as Maslow calls it, self-actualize. That's how important belonging is to all of us as human beings. We can't reach our full potential without grounding that sense of belonging. So I've said this word, belonging, several times in the few minutes that we've talked together on this webinar so far. But I want to ask you, what does belonging mean to you? I want you to use the chat. I'm going to open it up for a second so I can see what your responses are. But what does belonging mean to you? When you think about a time or a moment when you knew you absolutely belonged, when you felt that sense of belonging, what does it feel like for you? What word or feeling or experience does it bring up for you? I'm seeing village, accepted, comfort, safe, unconditional, close, being a part of, being seen, heard, accepted, valued, absolutely. You know, those are the answers that I get. I tend to get acceptance, home, respect, feeling appreciated. Sometimes I'll get being able to laugh, being able to feel authentic. But sometimes I'll get fitting in. And I want to be clear that belonging is not about fitting in. It's been said that to fit in, I have to be like you. Fitting in gives conformity spirit, right? But when I belong, I get to be me. Belonging is being accepted for who you are authentically. And fitting in, it's also about being accepted, but it's conditioned on you being like everyone else. At its basic level, belonging is the psychological safety that allows us to be all of who we are, that gives us room to reach our fullest potential. There was this article that I read at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic by Korean-American actor John Cho. You all may remember him from the Harold and Kumar franchise. And in that article, he talked about how, you know, he received a slew of hate messages and comments and threats in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. And he wrote about how growing up, his mother made him and his brother watch hours of television to make sure that they learned to speak and act like a real American. And he said that his mother's hope, his mother's wish was that his race, his background, the fact that he was Korean American would not be an issue for him. She hoped that once they became, quote unquote, American enough, that they would feel a sense of belonging as an American. And he goes on in the article to say that they actually felt glimmers of that hope come to fruition. You know, he became an actor and doors were open to him. And he said he probably became an actor because of all that TV watching that his mom made him do. But he became famous and people were nicer. Strangers were kinder. He felt accepted, right? He felt like he belonged. But then COVID-19 happened, and there was this onslaught of crimes and comments and just messages, hate messages against Asian Americans. And this raised a question for him. Is my belonging in America conditional? Have my efforts, all that work that I've been doing to fit in, have all my efforts been in vain? In his words, he says, one moment, we're Americans. And the next, we're all foreigners who brought the virus here. But Cho knows a sense of belonging is something we must create for ourselves and for others. He closed the article by saying he claimed the citizenship that his parents wanted for him. He's an American. He spent his lifetime earning it. So he's not going to let anybody tell him he's not really an American. Cho says he belongs, and he knows he belongs because he's earned it. But the truth is, not all of us have to earn it, right? There is this implicit privilege that comes with belonging to certain groups, particularly in this country. For some, there's an embedded sense of mattering, an embedded sense of belonging. And yes, all of us, no matter our background, our race, our creed, our ethnicity, our age, our gender identity, no matter any of that, all of us can think of a moment in our lives where we felt like we didn't belong. I mean, it's not an easy feeling to forget, right? But for some of us, that feeling plays out every single day. For some of us, when it comes to belonging, privilege is not really about the presence of a thing. It's much more about an absence. It's about an absence of the worry that your motives for being somewhere, anywhere, will be questioned rather than accepted without scrutiny. It's the absence of fear that your name might prevent you from being seen as a viable candidate for a job. It's the absence of the need to cover or code switch or put a mask on to fit in the workforce or the field. It's the absence of the concern that an evacuation plan or a preparedness plan hasn't really contemplated you if you can't see or walk or drive. It's the absence of worry that your population was totally excluded from a clinical trial for the drug you're currently taking. It's the absence of anxiety, the kind of anxiety that grips folks like Maya and others when they enter a breastfeeding clinic and they don't see anyone who looks like them. It's the absence of the sinking feeling when you hear about health disparity and statistic after statistic impacting your community. And despite working in the field, you feel powerless to really move the needle forward because your lived experience isn't viewed as expertise. Privilege is the absence of a default feeling of systemic exclusion, the absence of this feeling of otherness, of being less than many of us in historically excluded, historically marginalized communities often feel. And it impacts not only of our sense of belonging in this country, but it necessarily impacts our mental and physical health as well. I mean, did you all know that according to the Census Bureau, taken about a week after George Floyd's death, that anxiety and depression among Black Americans shot to higher rates than experienced by any other racial and ethnic group in this country? These mental health statistics, especially when coupled with the disproportionate burden of illness and death that we saw from COVID-19 and health disparities across the board, this really kind of helped us lean into the fact that provided further evidence that of what many of us in public health have been saying, and what research has shown is that racism, discrimination, our caste system in this country is a public health issue. Science shows that the isms, racism and discrimination and otherism that historically excluded populations experience in our daily lives creates stress, measurable stress that affects our internal organs, affects our overall physical health. The body keeps score. Study after study show that this stress results in a higher prevalence of chronic diseases, high blood pressure, asthma, diabetes, and shorter lifespans. It's been said, whether it's police-involved killings or disparate health outcomes where Black Americans can't get treatment because they're not seen as being sick, or financial redlining in certain zip codes, food deserts, or people of color getting hit by cars more often because their communities aren't walkable. It's all ultimately due to racism. In fact, and I know you know, when you consider most public health issues and conditions, you'll find striking disparities based on race, even when you take into account income. And we see similar disparities in breastfeeding as well. And these disparities are not the result of poor hygiene among communities of color, as one state senator has suggested. They are, in fact, the result of a deep-seated systemic set of isms, racism and bias, and a caste system that exists across all segments of our society, from our courthouses to our hospitals, to our schools, to our workplaces, to our public health departments, to our local, state, and federal governments. The body keeps score. Now, yes, high rates of poverty, unemployment, poor housing, toxic environmental exposure, less access to quality medical care, all of the social determinants of health, yes, they contribute significantly to health disparities, but belonging is also a social determinant of health. And these determinants, all of these determinants, are necessarily grounded in this system. And although public health is the most altruistic profession that exists out there, the reality is, whether we like it or not, our public health system, our healthcare system, our legal system, our educational system are staffed by human beings. Human beings, individuals who are subject to the various social constructs and projections and biases and beliefs that exist out there. Racism, bias, and discrimination are as much a part of public health as they are a part of the general population. But when we work in public health, we human beings that work in public health, we're in positions of authority, whether we think about it through that lens or not. We have the power to exert influence on another individual's experiences and outcomes in ways that can be profound and long-lasting and generational. Now, we didn't go through my whole bio, but I got to tell you, I'm a lawyer. I grew up in this field doing public health law. And there's a story that I like to tell to all my audiences that really kind of brings this point home. It's not a breastfeeding story, but I'm hopeful that the principles in this story will resonate with you. I want you to imagine again, at this point, you're going to imagine that you live in an unincorporated community just outside of a small city in the Appalachia region. The community that you live in is located in a small city called Zanesville, Ohio, and it's in the southeastern part of the state of Ohio. It's a tiny, majority Black community located just a few miles outside of the city center. Your community is called Coal Run. It's named after the road on which you and most of your community live. This area is the site of a formerly robust coal mine. And through the years, it's diminished, and your community sits right on top of a long abandoned coal mine that left behind pollution, which in turn contaminated groundwater and left behind water which looks maybe like the color of your morning coffee this morning. And you and your neighbors have to rely on alternative methods of obtaining safe water for cooking and drinking and bathing. So to get by, you collect rainwater and melted snow from your rooftops in buckets and cisterns that quickly become filled with vermin and insects. You only do laundry on days that it rains. You sit on your porch with your neighbors and you swap war stories about how your neighbor says as a child they would only they would run bathwater and only swap the bathwater out after 5 of the 10 children in the family had actually bathed. You buy water from the nearby water treatment plant, spending up to 10 times more than others in your area who have access to public water. You decide you're going to reach out to your city councilman, because up until 2002, the 21st century, this is important to point out, you and most of your neighbors still used outhouses. In fact, you spend 50 years trying to get access to public water. When you approach that county commissioner, city councilman, and you tell them that you want access to public water, they tell you that you and your neighbors won't get public water until the president drops spiral bombs in your community, and those bombs hit good water. That same commissioner tells you that you and your great-grandchildren would be lucky to have running water. So you contact the local health department, the most altruistic profession in the world, right? And when you do, the person who answers the phone, the public health practitioner who answers the phone, they tell you, you're going to have to dig a well, honey. But you know you shouldn't have to dig a well. There are water lines literally flowing throughout the county. Your county, Coal Run, is literally surrounded by publicly administered water lines. Now, when I tell this story, as you're listening to this story, folks are usually like, oh my God, those poor people, 50 years without running water when they're literally surrounded by publicly accessible water lines. The reality is, yes, they were poor. But Coal Run, your community in this case study, was also possibly the only majority Black community in the county. In 2002, the county was 94% white and about 4% Black. And the majority of the 4% of the county residents lived in Coal Run. So this treatment was definitely based on economics and socioeconomic status, but it was also based on race. So you and your neighbors, you file a complaint with the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and you assert a pattern and practice of discrimination that violated federal fair housing laws. The commission, after conducting its investigation, finds clear evidence that race, the fact that the residents of Coal Run were Black, was a factor in the local government's decision not to give you and your neighbors access to public water. This is a true story, and I tell the story because it brings home three overlapping dimensions: public health, health equity, and the law. Three dimensions that have really been the center of my career. The public health dimensions draw our attention to the social determinants of health, the structural, social, economic, cultural, political factors that order relationships in this country, that assign social status to members of different populations, that distribute money, power, and other resources that build or disrupt communities. In the case of Coal Run, the social determinants were really about their standing within the community as Black residents, the complicated infrastructure that allocates water across communities. It also really dealt with the socioeconomic conditions that resulted from the loss of the coal mining industry and the environmental degradation that resulted from the years of coal mining. But this story also draws our attention to this principle that all people should have access to the resources and social conditions needed to ensure that they can maximize their health. This concept of health equity. In the case of Coal Run, the reason that the community had a strong discrimination case was that compared to their white counterparts, they were not able to get access to a resource that was critical to their survival, water. But because of their race, because they lived in a poor community, because of their location in an unincorporated part of the county, they were subject to inequitable conditions that burdened their pockets, that stripped them of a great deal of time, increased their stress levels, and put them at risk. But y'all know, I told you, I'm a lawyer. So I've got to lean into the third dimension, and that's the law. And the law plays a central role in public health. It profoundly shapes the context in which we live, learn, play, work, and worship. It shapes our neighborhoods, our housing, our social environments. I often say there is no public health in this country without the law. It has the power to distribute those resources, to make the things that people need to live healthy lives more accessible. In the Coal Run story, we saw how a legal intervention, they filed a discrimination complaint that was necessary for the health of the community. But the reality is those kinds of legal interventions are not always the best approach. They take a lot of time, took 7 years to get results in that complaint. They cost a lot of money, and often that adversarial one-off approach is not in the best interests of the community. But I tell this story because stories like those of Coal Run are not as rare as you'd like to think. There's Sapelo Island in Georgia. There may be communities near you because the specifics of what happened in Coal Run may be unique, but the patterns are not. Public services, public health services, including breastfeeding services, are provided in unequal ways all over the country. And this inequity not only impacts health and health outcomes, but they're obstructive to feelings of belonging. People feel invisible. There's a old African proverb that says the child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. I want you to think about that for just a second. What comes to mind when you hear that? A child who is not embraced by the village will burn it down to feel its warmth. I know I see the protests of the summer of 2020 as a visual depiction of this proverb in real time. What felt like the seemingly continuous killing of unarmed Black and brown people right in the middle of the pandemic that again had a dramatically disparate impact on Black and brown people, served as a reminder that for many of us, for many Americans, belonging in this country is based on conditions that are often outside of our control and which are applied at best arbitrarily and at worst with the intent to exclude. These events really reminded many of us that far too often we don't feel the warmth of the laws and legal protections outlined in our country's founding documents, that all of us don't feel the warmth that is the promise of public health. These events also signal that if we want to see change in the health equity gap, the status quo won't work. But the reality is, it starts at home. I spent 20 years in this field loving on the public health workforce, and I know we can't effectively address health disparities or cultivate cultures of belonging among communities we serve if we don't center and cultivate a culture of belonging among our workforce. Cultures where innovation and new thinking and new ideas can be elevated, where human potential can be unleashed, cultures of psychological safety, cultures where people feel accepted, comfortable speaking their mind, making mistakes, and taking responsible risks, where lived experience is considered lived expertise and relied on and valued as such, cultures of belonging. And in the rest of our time together today, I want to offer some belonging-based leadership tips and strategies to do just that. And when I talk about belonging in the realm of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion in that paradigm, I try to tell folks to think about it like a boat. And the hull of the boat is what forms the foundation of the boat. Without it, there's no footing, there's no structure, there's no base. And the sails on the boat are used to give it force and action. And the rudder is what guides it in the right direction, keeping it on the right course toward the right destination or goal. Similarly, diversity forms the foundation of belonging. Diversity is really just the presence of things that are different from one another. And we see it expressed in different ways. You know, I talk in my speeches through the lens of being a Black American woman, but we see diversity through different races, ethnicity, language, religion, ages, disabilities, sexual orientation, gender identity, socioeconomic status, and so on. And when we think about the boat analogy, just like the rudder guides and changes the boat's direction, equity and inclusion should guide all we do. And the sails that power the boat are just like belonging, because they bring power to our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it takes all of us to create a culture of belonging. Belonging-based leadership, which is central to what I want to talk with you about next, is about sparking change and being a creator of belonging from where you sit right now. Because just like a boat needs a captain and a deck mate and officers and sailors and maintenance workers and cruise director and a DJ, because the only really real boats I'm really familiar with are cruises, honestly, as y'all can tell by this analogy. But it needs a wide variety of players to move the boat forward with a wide variety of expertise and skill set, as does belonging. It takes all of us. We are better together. It's time for us to lead through that lens. And I've created a tool that I want to share with you quickly called the SPARK model to help you do just that, the belonging-based leadership SPARK model, to lead through the lens of belonging from wherever you may sit. And as I walk through this model and shift through to the workforce, I want you to again, think about what action you can take to apply what you're learning today in your work in maternal and child health. So the S in the SPARK model, because those of us who work in government love an acronym. The S in the SPARK model is all about making space for authenticity. To be authentic means that you're truly showing up for yourself as yourself. We do our best work when our self-expression is in alignment with our internal sense of who we are, our internal sense of self, when we can be more of ourselves at work. Most of us hide or have hidden or have not expressed parts of our most authentic selves in the workplace at some point. We may actively mask or code switch or manage our behavior or emotions in a way to manage how we're perceived by coworkers. But the reality is it prevents us from using all of who we are in the workplace, and we need that innovation. I know from personal experience and from the experience of my clients that there are many folks who never feel safe enough to remove the mask. For some, being authentic at work can in and of itself be work. But when we're relying on our work personas to fit in an established workplace culture, when we're going against our nature, it's exhausting, and we're taking away time that we could be using, focusing on the mission, coming up with new ideas, relieving ourselves of some stress in this space so that we can do a better job at our work. Forcing ourselves to conform, to fit in, hinders our ability to produce and perform to our fullest potential. So when we can show up even just a little more authentically, it makes space for others to do the same. So the S in the SPARK model is about making space for authenticity, modeling that behavior. I will say there is one key trait in team members, in leaders, that makes space for folks in the workplace to show up more authentically. And I want to give you a hint. I want you to take a guess at what it is and put it in the chat. But I want to give you a hint. It starts with an H and it ends with a Y. Just take a guess. What trait is it in leaders and in teammates that you think makes space for people to show up more authentically in the workplace? Let me check out the chat. Starts with an A. Y'all got it. Have y'all heard this speech before? It's humility. It is absolutely humility. Studies show that when a supervisor or a boss is willing to show up a little more human in the workplace, authentically humble, when they display self-awareness, a willingness to admit mistakes, the capacity to be open-minded enough to appreciate and learn from others, they engender trust. And that trust inspires loyalty and heightened engagement. And it signals to folks around them that it's safe to show up in a more authentic way. All right. The P in the SPARK model is about being PC. And no, it's not about being politically correct. It's about being personally compassionate. It's about being power conscious. It's about being purposely civil. And it's about being people-centered. Belonging-based leadership requires recognizing that people have to be prioritized over production. Leaders who choose production in whatever way that looks, you choose production over people. And the clients that I work with who say, we've got to produce, we need to get this done, or there's a deadline, and the focus is on production over people, their excuse is that it takes too much time or energy to focus on the people, and that it's not worth the time, when in fact the opposite is true. The reality is when you focus on the people and you cultivate that culture of belonging, we get more production, better performance, more innovation. So I'd like to add that being PC also is about being professionally competent in the 21st century. And it starts with a mindset that shifts from what can I get out of this person to how can I help this person contribute to the mission in a way that is meaningful to them. Because People are the most important asset to any organization, any group, any shared space. We are what matters. No matter how far technology and AI takes us, people will remain the most important asset we have in public health. None of this works without people. And then we move to the A in the Spark model, which is about acceptance. So here I just want to ask you, like, how does it feel when your peers and your colleagues accept you for who you are rather than tolerate you? It feels good, right? It feels freeing. And I want to be clear here, acceptance doesn't mean approval. Acceptance is not about making excuses for bad behavior. It's not about not coaching or counseling. It's about recognizing the truth about something or someone without trying to fight it. It's about observing that truth. Accepting people doesn't necessarily mean that you agree with everything that they say or do. And again, it doesn't mean that you don't coach or counsel them. It doesn't mean that you don't downplay the impact of their behavior in the workplace or a team. But we all want to be accepted for who we are. And it's from that sense of acceptance that we can then be coached and counseled and that we grow. And belonging doesn't happen without that sense of acceptance. We all want to feel comfortable showing our best selves, our most authentic selves to the world. And that starts with acceptance. And again, you can accept someone and still take appropriate actions to protect and support yourself or others. In the belonging-based leadership model, developing an acceptance mindset starts by developing connection. People feel accepted when they have true and genuine connections. But we live in a world of time famine, where people are so busy all the time. You ask anybody how are you doing? Everybody wants to say busy. We live in a time where there's a curiosity deficit, so we don't make that connection. We think we know everything, or we can Google it, or AI will tell us, and we make statements as declarations instead of staying curious about why someone is behaving a certain way or what their values may be, so that we can meet people where they are and make space for them to show up more authentically. I believe that authenticity plus connection is what leads to acceptance. So we've got to make that time for connection. Folks are starving for connection. And one of the ways that I tell people or advise people to build connection in their work and in their workplaces is through a tool that I call, or that is called, Connect Before Content. It's Peter Block who says we must establish a personal connection with each other, connection before content. Without relatedness, no work can occur. Without relatedness, no work can occur. And this is so important in our work with one another, that we take a moment to connect with each other before we launch into the content of a meeting or a training, to take a moment to ask, where are folks dialing in from? How are you feeling? To not rush directly into the content, but it's also important in our work with communities. And I've actually created a tool on Connect Before Content that is really focused on building connection with community folks before you lean into the content, so that you can build that sense of connection and move into the lane of acceptance, which is critical for belonging. The R in the Spark model is all about representation. And I know you know what this one means. I'll just say here that representation opens the doors for the opportunity for those of us, particularly for marginalized communities, to be centered, for diverse opportunities and voices and experiences to be heard and embraced. From my perspective, representation is about seeing yourself reflected at the very highest positions in an organization, or in a political system, or at a table where decisions are being made. Because what we see becomes a part of our existence. It becomes a part of our memory. It becomes possible when we see it. Representation shapes the way we see the world. It shapes the way we see ourselves in the world and the way we see others in the world. Representation helps us be biased toward believing it's possible. And studies show that we're much more engaged and committed and productive when we can identify with and see ourselves represented in those who have succeeded, when we can visualize ourselves doing the same thing. And this is true across visible diversity and across invisible diversity. In those spaces, where it's safe enough for folks who have traits on the invisible diversity spectrum to bring those traits to light. So the fourth element in the SPARK model is really focused on representation. And the K in the SPARK model is all about knowing your biases. If you hadn't heard it before, I'm gonna break some news to you. If you are breathing, you are biased. If you were educated in this country, you are biased. If you watch television in this country, you are biased. If you consume propaganda in any way in this country, you are biased. Every single one of us has biases that affect how we view the world and the people in it. Some of us are explicitly racist and sexist and classic or homophobic, right, as human beings, right? So folks like that, they know it and they don't care. But implicit bias is much sneakier, and it shows up in systemic and sneaky ways. It shows up in attitudes and in stereotypes, and it comes by way of social programming that we carry and that we project onto others that we're not always aware of. And our biases, no matter how conscious we are of them, or whether they're unconscious biases, they're obstructive to creating a culture of belonging, full stop. This is why knowing and overcoming your biases is the fifth element of the belonging-based leadership SPARK model. And although it is the final element of this model, doing the work of identifying and overcoming your biases is really the beginning of any belonging journey. I've been doing this work for years, many certifications, doing my own inner work in this area, and I'm still unlearning the biases that I've formed, that I've been subject to and formed throughout my life. And I've learned that it's about identifying them, reflecting them, and addressing them. Repeat, identifying them, reflecting on them, and addressing them. If you haven't already, I'd encourage you to take the Harvard Implicit Bias Assessments. There are several assessments on there around bias related to race, gender, age, a wide variety of I think there's 22 assessments that you can take. And if you want to do further work on this, you can consider hiring a coach or journaling about specific situations where your biases may be intruding or impacting your ability to be an effective colleague or leader or a friend. And one of the things that I suggest that folks do as a first step, it's a really simple first step, is going someplace where you're exposed to diversity. It's so simple, but a lot of folks don't do it. Think about a different grocery store, in a different neighborhood, a different church, a different school, a different football game. It seems simple, but as humans, we tend to live our lives without much social connection to others. That impacts our capacity for connection with others. In fact, I found a study from the Public Religion Research Institute that found that 75% of white Americans have entirely white social networks without any minority presence. So all of us need to be asking ourselves, where can we go to be in the company of people who are different from me? How can we build connection from folks that come from different backgrounds, that have different ways of being, so that we can use that to identify, address, and overcome our biases, and then go and intentionally connect. So that was a quick introduction to the SPARK model. I hope that this added some value in this webinar today. You can grab a copy of the SPARK model here at this QR code on the screen here. As I mentioned, I offer workshops and coaching to teams and individuals on the SPARK model and on belonging-based leadership. I hope that this really resonates with you in some way in your work in maternal and child health, and that you can find ways that you can anchor your sense of belonging and become or continue being a creator of belonging in all of your shared spaces. Before I close, there's a fun thing I'd like for us to do. I think it's fun. I don't know if you all remember, but in 2022, this woman on the screen here, Cheryl Lee Ralph, she won the award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in Comedy for her role in Abbott Elementary. Her name is Cheryl Lee Ralph. She also happens to be my sorority sister. She was just the second Black woman to ever win that particular Emmy, and she'd been doing this work, singing and acting, being on stages for 30, 40 years before winning the award. And she's celebrated by not saying an award speech, but she sang her award speech. And I'm no singer, so I'm not going to sing it to you. But I do want to recite what she said. She said, "I am an endangered species. but I sing no victim song. I am a woman, I am an artist, and I know where my voice belongs. And when I heard that, I literally cried. I got chills. It felt like a rallying cry, it felt like a reminder, like an affirmation. And I started adding this to some of my speeches. I took those words and created an affirmation to remind all of us who we are and what we're fighting for. So we're on a Zoom. I want you to stay on mute. But if you're willing to go along with me, I want you to say it aloud or to yourself. I want you to repeat after me. I am a proud advocate for breastfeeding and breastfeeding parents.
I am a proud advocate for breastfeeding and breastfeeding parents.
And I am a creator of belonging.
And I am a creator of belonging.
And I know where my voice belongs.
And I know where my voice belongs.
Now, if we'd be in person, I'd be saying, say it louder, say it louder. Get into the spirit of it. Go ahead, Udag, say it louder.
For breastfeeding, and I'm breastfeeding parents, and I am a creator of belonging, and I know where my voice belongs.
And I know where my voice belongs. And I want you to say it until it becomes true for you. Yeah. Because the reality, that's exactly what folks like Maya need from us. Folks like Maya are waiting for us to come together to use our diverse skill set, experiences, our backgrounds to create a culture of belonging within our field so our best thinking can be elevated and our potential can be unleashed so that we can create spaces for folks like Maya to thrive and have access to everything they need to live healthy lives. And so with that, I want to say thank you for your time and attention today. I hope maybe we have some time for some engagement if you all have some Q&A. And thank you all.
As usual, Montrece, phenomenal. And I say it opens such a breadth of opportunity to reflect as practitioners in this space, to think through how we engage, think through how we situate ourselves in this space, how we feel in relation to our own belonging in this space. And so absolutely appreciate you for this presentation. The chat is going wild per usual with thank yous as well. And so I think we may have, I know we're close to coming up towards the end of time, but I do want to lift opportunity for maybe one or two questions that could possibly come from the audience. If folks are willing to stay, the Zoom room won't close automatically. So folks are open to hang out just a little bit longer if there's any particular questions we want to lift to Montrece.
Happy to take any questions. I do want to say thank you all for the comments in the chat. I appreciate every single note and comment and thought, and just for you all taking the time to be here in this space. I know that there's a lot of opportunity for you all to think about how these principles align with your health equity work and the work you do in your day-to-day professional lives. But I hope that I caused you to think about how belonging impacts you personally and how the sense of belonging grounds you in your work in maternal and child health and the communities that you serve. So again, thank you all. And please reach out to me. I'd love to connect.
Thank you so much on behalf of MHLIC and Andrea from Rose. It was stupendous. We did have a question about whether there was a direct link to these instruments.
Yes, yes, yeah, I can share the link. I'll send the link. It'll take me a second to find it. I can put it in the chat.
Yeah, and we can just make sure to add it to the
perfect.
I did put it in the chat already. I'll go ahead and paste it one more time. And then for everyone, as mentioned, this session is recorded and it will be shared out and available on the Maternal Health Learning Innovation Center website, where some of the links discussed also are going to be a part of the blurb that comes with sharing out about this recording. So
right, and if you've registered, you will get I will send you the recording. I mean, you'll get a link to it.
Well, once again, thank you. Oh, well, we do have think one question, are you familiar with the Pump Act, how the law now helps breastfeeding women belong at work?
I am not familiar with the Pump Act, but I will be doing some research. Before we joined this call, I was saying how I've been doing many, many more calls with the maternal and child health and breastfeeding workforce. And so, yes, because that way I can work in some stories about the Pump Act into my talk. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. Well, once again, thank you so much, Montrece.
Yes, indeed.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining in and listening, joining us today. So with that, hopefully everyone continues to enjoy the rest of their Wednesday.